Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
Now we come to Paul's second extant letter to the Corinthians. So remember that by saying extant, it means the second existing letter that we have. But we also know that St. Paul tells us in his second letter to the Corinthians, he talks about a tearful letter that he wrote to them. And so we figure that this tearful letter came between the first letter and the second letter to the Corinthians, which simply means that the second letter to the Corinthians is really not the second letter to the Corinthians. So far, so good? The second letter is not the second letter to the Corinthians. It's actually the third or fourth, say, because there was at least one other letter that came between the first letter to the Corinthians and the second extant or existing letter to the Corinthians. It may be one of Paul's most persuasive letters, though, this second letter to the Corinthians, and there are many unforgettable passages. There are different passages which we've probably heard of. They trace their way back to the second letter to the Corinthians. And the second letter to the Corinthians also gives us this image of Paul being rejected and of being suffering and of being misunderstood, unlike any other letter that we have from Paul. What we get from the second letter to Corinthians is this rejected and suffering and misunderstood apostle. And Paul is writing about it all in his own words. A bit of background. So St. Paul is writing to these same people in Corinth. We said that these two letters, the first and second extant letters to the Corinthians, are the longest letters that Paul wrote to any community. So Paul wrote more to the Corinthians than to any other community. So he's writing to the Corinthians again, this time maybe around the year 55 to 57 AD. We don't know again. And we're guessing that maybe it was written from Macedonia, though we're not sure. It's interesting because Paul's first letter to the Corinthians deals with a lot of problems, right? Ranging from sex to food offered to idols, to divisions within the community. Some are for Paul, some are for Apollos, some are for Cephas, some are for Christ. So he's dealing with all these problems. It seems like the tearful letter is almost like a letter that was written to win them back, to which he's referring in the second letter to the Corinthians. So it's almost like he tones this next letter to the Corinthians down only because he came across rough to the Galatians, and he came across a bit strong with the Corinthians as well. And so it's interesting, whereas the first letter to the Corinthians was addressed to the Church of God in Corinth and to Christians everywhere, or he uses the word saints. When he says saints, to the saints in Corinth, he's referring to the Christians in Corinth, right? This, though, is addressed to the Church of God in Corinth, together with all God's holy people throughout Achaia. So he's aiming this one not only to Corinth, but to all the people throughout Achaia. Why is this one directed not only to Corinth, but all Achaia? One theory is that Paul was getting ready to take up a collection throughout Achaia. And so this letter is not just meant for the Corinthians, but everyone who's going to be part of this collection that he's going to speak about, he's writing this letter not only to the Corinthians, but to everyone whom he's going to be asking to participate in this collection. They had collections even back then. Paul is going to request the collection in chapter 8, verses 1 to 5. Now what's interesting is that he's going to hold up the example of the Macedonians, saying, take as your example the Macedonians. Are they rich? No, but they responded extremely generously. And he's also going to give them the example of Jesus, who, though he was rich for your sake, he became poor, so that you might become rich by his poverty. So it's interesting that Paul is taking up this collection. The question is, taking up collections to help the poor and everything, that's biblical. It traces its way back to Psalm 112. But why was he taking money for the poor in Jerusalem? Aren't there poor people everywhere? Isn't that what we hear with our own social ministry collection? Why are we giving to these people like over in Africa? We have poor people here in the United States. So why was Paul taking this collection for the poor in Jerusalem? Do we remember his relationship with James, the brother of the Lord, who was the head of the church in Jerusalem? Did they have a tight relationship? They differed on a lot of issues, right? It was James who was saying, we have to continue to follow the law. We have to continue to be circumcised. And so Paul had his differences with James. So we're imagining, for instance, that by taking a collection to Jerusalem, there were probably various advantages to that, right? To be able to go back to James, even though you've had your differences with James, and be able to say, James, I've got good news for you. We took up a collection in our churches in Corinth and Macedonia and throughout Achaia, and I'd like to be able to share with you what it is that they raised for you. How's that for a gesture of goodwill? It's interesting, too, because Paul was now preaching to the Gentiles, the non-Jews in many of these places, in Corinth, for instance. And so for the Gentiles to be assisting the Jews, it sort of reinforces this belief of St. Paul that there is no Jew or Greek. We're all one. So we have to take care of one another's needs. And so if there are needs in Jerusalem among the Jewish people, our brothers and sisters there, then we need to take care of that. We also have an indication in the second letter to the Corinthians that there are some apostles, or would-be super apostles, if you will, who are undermining Paul. In the same way, this brings to mind Galatians again. Remember, in Galatians, Paul preached, and there were others who came in and preached a different message. Here we have people who are preaching a message that's undermining Paul's message, or Paul's gospel. He's not as strong here as he is in his letter to the Galatians, but he does call them false apostles, deceitful workers, masquerading as apostles of Christ. And if we read chapter 11, verses 13 to 15, he says, just like Satan masqueraded as the angel of light. Do we know that story? According to the story, Satan, Lucifer, what does Lucifer mean? Anytime we see F-E-R at the end of a word, it means someone who carries something. So St. Christopher carried whom? Christ. Oh, the Christ bearer. So Lucifer is one who carries the Lucifer. What's that? In Spanish we use luz, the light bearer. Satan was the bearer of light. So what St. Paul is telling us is in the same way that Satan used to be the bearer of light and masqueraded as the bearer of light, so these apostles, these people are masquerading as apostles of Christ, but they're just deceitful workers. They're false apostles. Don't believe them. Don't believe their gospel. It reminds us of the letter to the Galatians, right? Even if an angel comes down from God in heaven with another gospel, don't believe it. Various challenges with the second extant letter to the Corinthians. Various challenges with the second extant letter to the Corinthians. How do we interpret the one who knew no sin for our sake, God made sin? In the second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 5, verse 21, St. Paul tells us that Jesus, the one who knew no sin, was made, what? Sin. Jesus was made sin. Think about that for a moment. Because there are various later New Testament sources written in the second half of the first century, like the Gospel of John or the letter to the Hebrews, 1 Peter, the first letter of John, which say that Jesus was sinless. Jesus was without sin. We've heard that before, right? And here it is, Paul is telling us that Jesus was made sin. So the question is, how do we interpret that? Is St. Paul saying that God made Jesus personally a sinner? Who then would be an object of God's disfavor, because does God like sinners? God doesn't like sinners, so if Jesus is a sinner, God would not be looking kindly on Jesus. Then again, remember how it was that in the garden, for instance, St. Mark tells us that Jesus was being offered a chalice of suffering, of God's wrath. And what did Jesus say? Jesus said, please take this cup away from me. It's almost how it is that Jesus was rejecting that will of God for him. I mean, in the end, he says, if it's your will, I'll do it. But at the same time, he was pushing away, showing some resistance to that. Or was it simply that God allowed Jesus to be considered a sinner? Not that Jesus was a sinner, but people considered him a sinner. Like all those Pharisees who accused him of blaspheming, of breaking the Sabbath, of breaking the law. It's not that he was a sinner, it's that people considered him a sinner. They thought he was a sinner. I mean, he even died a death that was accursed by God. We remember that in the letter of Galatians, he tells us, chapter 3, verse 13, Christ became a curse for us. In the second letter to the Corinthians, he's saying Christ was made sin, Jesus was made sin. But in Galatians, it said Christ became a curse for us. How so? He says, for it was written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree. Remember, that's from the book of Leviticus and the book of Deuteronomy. How it was that anyone who hung on a tree died a goddamn death. If you were crucified, that means that you enjoyed God's disfavor. If you died on a cross, if you were crucified, then you were cursed by God. You were no friend of God if you died crucified. So how interesting that maybe people consider Jesus a sinner because of, for instance, the way that he died, but he really wasn't. Or was it simply the fact that God allowed Jesus to stand in for our sinful humanity, because the sentence continues, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So it's almost like Jesus standing in our place, even though Jesus was sinless, standing in for sinful humanity. So how to interpret that? There could be different interpretations, ranging from the fact that St. Paul may be suggesting that God made Jesus personally a sinner, to how it was that Jesus wasn't a sinner but was considered a sinner, to how it was that he stood in for sinful humanity. Or another interpretation would be that Jesus was an offering for sin. Because in Greek, the book of Leviticus, translated into the Septuagint in Greek, literally used the word sin for sin offering. So what's the difference between sin and a sin offering? A sin offering, like Jesus and his death on the cross, if you intertwine the two, sin offering is what Jesus did on the cross. But if you put the word sin, like the book of Leviticus does, if you interchange the two, then sin and sin offering could be seen as the same. And the final issue with the second letter to the Corinthians then is, did Paul really work miracles? We heard about that in the Acts of the Apostles, right? How it was that Paul, for instance, sent that spirit out of that female slave who was able to tell fortunes. And because of that, the owner of the slave got mad. Okay, did Paul really expel demons like that and work other miracles? We only have one instance in Paul's letters when he talks about it. In the second letter to the Corinthians, it talks about how Paul worked the marks of a true apostle, including signs, wonders, and miracles. Does he describe any of them? Does he tell us what any of them were? Does he talk about sending a spirit out of a female slave? A spirit that could foretell the future? Doesn't tell us anything. That's as close as we get to St. Paul himself saying that he worked signs or miracles among the people that he preached to. You get it right?
But that wouldn't serve his purpose to say that way back then, because, you know, he was already converting people. He didn't need the propaganda.
He didn't need the propaganda. So part of it, Luke was selling people on the fact that these things were happening. So Luke could talk about all of these things happening. St. Paul probably thought to himself that same thing. I don't need to do that. You know what? I tell them the story of Jesus and all the wonders and signs that Jesus worked. I don't have to work the same signs myself. I don't have to walk on water for people who believe in Jesus. I just tell them the stories of Jesus healing and walking on water and calming storms and multiplying bread and doing all the things that Jesus did. I don't have to do those things myself for people to believe. I can preach Jesus without having to work miracles and still bring people to Christ. And today, oh, what good news that is. That we don't have to handle serpents. Remember the Gospel of Mark, right? If you believe in me, you'll be able to handle venomous snakes. Thank goodness we don't have to go to Holy Family on Sunday and handle venomous snakes, right? No, we don't have to work these signs and miracles and wonders. For us, it's simply doing what is ours to do.